Hey, Katie. We have The Whispering Statue. We are on Chapter 11, Telltale Letter. Nancy was horrified to see that Mr. Atkin was motionless in his chair. The upper part of his body was face down on the desk. She rushed in and immediately felt his pulse. It was extremely faint and intermittent. "Anyway, he's alive," she murmured, "but I must get help." She hurried back to Mr. and Mrs. Thompson and told them what had happened. "Please come," she begged. They immediately followed her. Mr. Thompson, a physical education teacher, gave the victim a quick examination and said that he thought Mr. Atkin had had a heart attack.
"We must get him to the hospital as quickly as possible. Nancy, call the police and get an ambulance here right away."
As she dialed the number, the River Heights couple gently laid the patient on the floor. Mrs. Thompson took some smelling salts from her handbag and tried to revive Mr. Atkin. There was no response.
Really, they should be doing CPR.
Nancy, by this time, was talking to Captain Turner. When she told of her discovery, he said a hospital ambulance would be sent at once to the shop. Within minutes, a doctor was giving the victim oxygen.
"He's in bad shape,"
the doctor said. During this procedure, Nancy had been glancing round the office to learn as much as she could about it. On the desk lay a penciled notation. It read, M.D. as in D.E. K. 500 on account. Just then, Mr. Basswood walked in. He turned pale at the sight.
"What happened?"
he asked. Nancy replied, "Apparently Mr. Atkin has had a heart attack. I found the door unlocked and entered. He was slumped across the desk. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson came in to help." The shop owner gave her a searching look.
"This office is private, and I don't like any outsiders coming into it," he said unpleasantly.
The doctor and Mr. and Mrs. Thompson looked at the man in disgust. He did not seem the least bit concerned about the condition of his assistant. What a jerk.
"I'm taking Mr. Atkin to the hospital,"
the doctor told him.
"Very well, and be quick about it,"
Mr. Basswood said icily. A stretcher was brought in, but before Mr. Atkin could be put on it, Mr. Basswood ordered Nancy and the Thompsons out of the office. The instant the victim had been removed, he stepped outside, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Nancy was shocked by the man's rudeness, but she said calmly, "Mr. Basswood, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson bought 2 books and a statuette. I left these in the sales slip in your office."
"I'll get them,"
the shop owner said. He brought them outside and told Nancy to wrap the 2 volumes.
"I'll attend to the statuette myself,"
he said, handing the change to Mr. Thompson. After he had disappeared into the back room, Mrs. Thompson whispered to Nancy, "Don't bother to wrap the books. They're so small they'll fit in my purse. How do you stand to work here for such a man? And why are you here?" "I can't tell you now." Nancy glanced at her watch. "It's almost lunchtime. Where are you going?" "To the yacht club." "Would you mind giving me a ride?" Nancy asked.
"Glad to,"
Mr. Thompson said. Presently, Mr. Basswood arrived with the statuette.
"I noticed from the sales slip that you're from River Heights," he said. "By any chance, do you know Carson Drew, who lives there with his daughter, Nancy?"
Nancy did not show any emotion at the question. She listened intently for her friend's answer. To her delight, Mr. Thompson replied,
"Mr. Drew is a prominent lawyer in town. He's well known. I understand his daughter is very attractive."
Mrs. Thompson spoke up. "She has the loveliest golden red hair you ever saw." Nancy could have hugged both of them, but she remained motionless. She said to the shop owner, "It's 12 o'clock. May I go now?"
"All right, but be back here promptly at 2.
He turned and walked away without another word. The Thompsons grinned and shook their heads. A few minutes later, Nancy was in the couple's car and heading toward the yacht club. Mr. Thompson asked Nancy,
"What name are you using? I don't want to make a mistake if I happen to see you in the lobby or the dining room."
His question reminded Nancy that she had promised to tell him and his wife about her case. Without going into detail or involving Mr. Basswood directly, she said she was trying to trace a collection of books he had been commissioned to sell. Since he was so uncommunicative on the subject, she was hoping to pick up some clues at the shop. When they reached the yacht club, Bess and George were waiting for Nancy. After she had thanked the Thompsons and introduced them to her friends, Bess drew her aside. "Come into Mr. Ayer's office," she whispered excitedly. "He has some news for you." The girls excused themselves and hurried off to talk to the manager. He gave Nancy a broad smile.
"Miss Lynbrook," he said, "you're certainly on the right track. Mrs. Merriam was here. In one of the books that Ned bought, she found a letter which had been written by her uncle to her father, but never mailed."
"That's a marvelous clue," Nancy exclaimed. "There's no doubt the books are hers."
"It certainly looks," said Mr. Ayer, "as if Mr. Basswood is guilty of fraud."
George spoke up. "What are you going to do? Have him arrested?" Nancy shook her head. "Not until I notify my father. By the way, Mr. Basswood's assistant is in the hospital." "What?" the others cried. Nancy told them about Mr. Atkins suffering a heart attack. "I wonder how he is. When I go back to the shop this afternoon, I'll find out." Bess asked, "When you were in Mr. Basswood's office, did you see anything suspicious?" "No, but I saw an interesting notation on his desk." She told about the note saying M.D.K. 500 on account. Nancy asked Mr. Ayer if she might use his phone to get in touch with her father. He nodded and she put in the call. Mr. Drew was neither in his office nor at home. According to his secretary, the lawyer was in Washington. "If he calls here, I'll give him your message," she told Nancy. The girls went to the dining room for lunch, but did not talk about the mystery, afraid that someone might overhear them. Nancy, however, could not keep her mind off it. "One thing seems certain," she said to herself. "Since Mr. Atkins has access to Mr. Basswood's office, he must know what's going on and is in league with his employer." She was determined to do more sleuthing in the shop. When Nancy arrived there, she asked Mr. Basswood how his assistant was. He answered nonchalantly,
"Oh, he'll be all right. Atkins gets these attacks once in a while. Doesn't watch his health."
At that moment a customer arrived, and Nancy asked if she could help him. This was the beginning of a very busy afternoon for her. Mr. Basswood did not wait on anyone, so Nancy had no chance to do any investigating in the shop. At 4 o'clock sharp, he told her to go and lock the door behind her. As she walked toward the taxi stand, the young detective said to herself, "If I had this job as my real livelihood, I'd certainly ask for higher wages. Mr. Basswood is a selfish old meanie. In the short time I've been here, I've brought him over $1,000 in sales." Nancy was cheered, however, by the one possible clue she had discovered, the mysterious M.D.K. notation. A visitor was waiting for her at the yacht club. A pleasant, serious-faced man of about 40 said he was Sir Sylvester Holden and had come to examine the statue on the front lawn. In a low tone he said, "Your father sent me." Nancy nodded. Mr. Ayer, Bess, and George followed Nancy and Mr. Holden outdoors. The sculptor carried a small bag of tools.
"This is a fine piece," he remarked as they approached the statue. "I suspect it is a reproduction, however."
He took a strong magnifying glass from his toolkit and spent several minutes going over the statue. Presently he brought out a chisel and tapped the marble.
"It doesn't ring," he said. "An original wood. This piece is made from marble dust mixed with a white casting cement, but I must say it's one of the finest reproductions I've ever seen." "Do you think it was made in this country?"
Mr. Ayer asked. Mr. Holden said there was no way of being sure, but he suspected that it had been made in the United States.
"I think this is powdered Vermont marble."
Nancy spoke up. "Can you give us any clue about how we might find who the sculptor was?"
"That depends on whether or not the person who made the piece wants to keep his identity a secret. Most sculptors and makers of reproductions put a mark on the base of the statue. Let's turn this lady on her side and take a look.
Let's hope it hasn't been cemented down, Nancy remarked. She was relieved to find this had not been done yet. The statue was tipped over and gently laid on the lawn. Everyone peered at the base. I see something, Nancy exclaimed. It's very faint, but it says MDK. Ooh, so maybe that's the name of the sculpture. Maybe, ooh, lots of possibilities. We'll have to find out.